In the last few videos, we've talked about numbers, strings, and booleans, and finally we're going to be talking about null and undefined, which are the types you use when you want to represent that you have nothing yet. Because we've talked all about variables that actually have a value. They have a value of 1, a value of true, a value of hello world. But what happens when you have a variable that doesn't have any value at all? Well, that's what null and undefined represent. So let's create a variable. We're going to create a variable a, and we're going to give it a value of undefined. This just means that we don't have a defined value for a yet. And we can come down console.log out a, and you'll see we get this text undefined being printed out to the screen saying that it's an undefined variable. We don't have any value for it yet. And when we check the type of a, we're going to get that value of undefined here, which is exactly what we expect. And we can do the exact same thing here for null. And if we just print out a, you can see that we get the text of null being printed out because this doesn't have a value. You will notice something really peculiar though. When we do the type of a, we get this weird type object. And this is just an artifact of the way JavaScript is actually created. The reason that this says object as the type is just because null is represented as an object. This is not at all important. I just want you to know this because if you try this out yourself and you see object being printed out, you may think you're doing something wrong, but this is just how JavaScript is set up. But again, like I said, it is not at all important. All you need to know is that null is essentially its own type. Think about null as its own type null, and just ignore what this type of says because it really doesn't mean anything useful. So we have null and we have undefined. But what is the difference between the two if they both mean that the value hasn't been set yet? Well, a really easy way to see that difference is to create a variable, but don't actually give it a value. Because normally we say equals, and then we pass in some value here. What if we just create a variable a, like this? What will a be? Well, we can actually print it out by saving here, and you'll see it gets the value undefined. And that's because we've created a variable a, but we haven't actually defined a value for a yet. So undefined essentially means you have something, but you have not given it a defined value. Null, on the other hand, means that you have specifically set the value of null to a. You have specifically said, hey, a is equal to null. So you've given this a value, but this value is nothing. You're saying that a has no value, but I specifically have told it that it has no value, which is why it is null now instead of undefined. To be completely honest, the differences between undefined and null and when to use which over the other really is quite minute, and it's not important. Generally, if you're going to use null or undefined, they're quite interchangeable, and you can use either one to represent null. Usually, I will use null when I'm setting a value, just because null kind of defines an empty value, a value that does not exist. While, like I mentioned, undefined is more for saying that this is a value that doesn't even exist yet. It hasn't been set to anything, while null is me explicitly saying this has no value, it has nothing. And now with all this talk of null and undefined, you're probably wondering, why the heck would I ever use null? I mean, I always want to set a value to my variable. Why would I set it to no value? And the reason for this is imagine that you're writing out some code that's talking to Amazon, and you're asking Amazon if they have a product by a specific name. You type in the name, and what if Amazon doesn't have that product? Well, obviously they need to return to you to tell you, I don't have that product. So they're going to return to you null, saying there is nothing with that name. So they give you the value of null in return to say that they don't have that product. This is a very common place where you'll see null because you're expecting a response, but they don't have any response to give you, so they give you null instead as the value for your variable of that product from Amazon. And this is everything that you need to know about null and undefined. They just really mean that you have no value. Now in the next video, I'm going to talk about how we can compare variables with each other to determine if they're the same, if they're larger, smaller, all that fun stuff, so I can't wait to see you in the next video.